Thank you for joining us for the 2024 presentation regarding legislative updates. The purpose of this presentation is to promote awareness regarding several education-related acts of the legislature passed during the 2024 regular legislative session. This presentation does not constitute legal advice, but it will communicate responses to these acts by the Louisiana Department of Education. The 2024 regular legislative session saw more than 2,000 legislative instruments filed. LDOE tracked almost 200 of these, available for viewing in our legislative implementation tracker, and we also curated a list of acts for system leaders. This presentation does not contain all of the acts that were passed, but we have grouped the acts we'll talk about today into 6 areas: let teachers teach, academics, special education, health and safety, school choice, and administration. Several key legislative acts align with recent recommendations of the Let Teachers Teach Task Force. Acts 686 and 716 relate to required trainings for teachers and students. Many of the required trainings in statute were repealed, allowing Bessie to consider whether and how training on these topics should be required in policy. Some of the required teacher trainings, like training regarding communicable diseases, are being recommended to move to a one-and-done model, with teachers completing the training once and both the teacher and school maintaining documentation that the training has been completed. If the teacher moves to a different school, the teacher can give a copy of the training certificate to the new school to maintain. Where the student trainings, including topics like substance abuse awareness and eating disorder awareness, are presently incorporated into health education standards, the content standard will remain addressed through the LDOE and Bessie standards revision process. Other trainings will move to a model of information dissemination. Schools may implement this in several ways, including through the provision of information in a student handbook or planner, so students will have ready access to the information instead of a once-a-year training. More information about changes to required training for specific topics, as well as resources for implementation, is in development and will be released after the August Bessie meeting. Act 313 relates to student possession of telecommunications devices during the instructional day. This law is now in effect, and Bessie at its August meeting will consider revisions to Bulletin to bring policy into alignment with statute. Local boards will need to develop policy to address several key elements, including definitions and applicability, with a focus on students' ability to give full attention to instruction during the school day. Act 400 relates to the removal of students who persistently disrupt the learning environment. When a student behavior issue is preventing the instructional process for the rest of the class, the student must be removed from the classroom so that the behavior can be appropriately addressed while instruction continues. Bessie will consider revisions to relevant policy at its August meeting, and school leaders are encouraged to review the updated discipline policy as well as their own local discipline policy. Act 337 relates to expulsion for certain behaviors and upon receiving a third suspension not related to tardiness or dress code violations. Bessie will consider policy revisions in August to align policy with the updated statute. Local policy should also be considered for review. Act 311 relates to teacher compensation for overtime work and for work beyond prescribed duties. Local schools and districts are encouraged to review the act for further action needed. Act 386 increases the importance of making up schoolwork missed due to student absences. Local boards will need to consider how to facilitate student opportunities to complete missing work, as well as parent information sessions related to student progress. Several key acts of the legislature this session address student academic performance. Act 771 provides for expanded academic support and high-dosage tutoring in an effort to close academic gaps in reading and math in elementary grades. Policy related to the provision of tutoring and the related planning and reporting requirements is scheduled for Bessie consideration in August, and guidance and additional resources are now available on the LDOE website. It is important to note that district-level plans for expanded academic support are due to the LDOE by September 15th. Act 649 expands the Steve Carter Education Program to include both literacy, or ELA, and mathematics for students in grades kindergarten through grade 12. The program has been funded for this school year, and updated guidance is now available. It is important for schools to notify families of struggling students about this opportunity for additional support outside of the school day. Act 492 relates to teachers' ability to provide tutoring outside of the school day to students enrolled in the schools at which they teach. Schools may consider informing parents of tutoring opportunities that are available, as well as a list of educators who are interested in tutoring outside of school hours. Act 211 makes computer science a requirement for graduation for upcoming graduation cohorts. It also requires computer science instruction be offered to elementary and middle grade students in the next few years, as well as the incorporation of computer science into existing courses of study for educator candidates. Relevant policy revisions will be considered by Bessie at the October and December meetings of the board. The Computer Science K-12 Standard Writing Committee is nearing the end of the development of Louisiana's first computer science standards. More information and resources will be released in the near future about opportunities to engage in computer science instruction. Act 650 replicates for math many of the successful changes we have seen with literacy over the past few years. Information will be forthcoming regarding progress toward identification of a universal numeracy screener. In the meantime, schools should begin identifying students struggling with early numeracy and supporting them with interventions and ways that families can support them at home. This act also provides for the consolidation of several different types of student-facing academic plans into a single, multifaceted plan that should be both easier to families to understand and more efficient for schools to implement. A first set of related policy revisions is scheduled for board consideration in August. Act 428 requires that a uniform 10-point grading scale be used for students enrolled in any grade for which letter grades are used. Bessie policy will be recommended for revision to align with this statute at the August meeting of the board. Several acts of the legislature directly impact the way schools meet the needs of students with special needs. As you can see from the amount of text on this slide, Act 198 contained a number of provisions related to special education. Bessie policy has been developed in response to each of these components and will be ready for Bessie consideration at the August meeting. Act 689 requires that certain information regarding tutorship be provided to parents of upper grade students with disabilities at IEP meetings. The parent handbook is currently being updated to include this information and will soon be available for use by schools. Act 512 relates to notice that must be provided to parents related to changes in the provision of special education services. It also provides for parent or guardian ability to postpone IEP meetings to a reasonable alternative date or time. Relevant policy revisions have been drafted for Bessie consideration in August. Acts 517 and 525 provide for subsequent dyslexia testing by a school, vendor, or professional approved by the LDOE. Policy revisions are in development and are scheduled for Bessie consideration in October. Additional information regarding this matter will be forthcoming. Act 499 will exempt students with dyslexia from the Universal Literacy Screener taken by students in kindergarten through third grade. Instead, schools will need to annually administer these students a nationally normed reference test assessing phonological skills and oral reading fluency. Implementation of this act is contingent upon receipt of a waiver approval of SEA provisions from the USDOE. This waiver request was submitted July 9th and is awaiting approval. Upon receipt of a response, further information regarding next steps will be communicated. Several acts of the legislature this year are related to health and safety. Act 216 updates the mandatory reporter definition to include school resource officers and requires direct reporting by mandatory reporters. Local board policy should be reviewed to ensure prompt and direct reporting. Act 421 requires the provision of information regarding cardiac health to student athletes and their families. This information has been developed with consultation from the Louisiana Department of Health and will shortly be released for distribution. Act 95 requires that high school employees who serve as school coaches maintain certification in CPR, first aid, and AED use. Implementation is contingent upon local receipt of funding for this purpose. Act 161 allows authorized licensed providers from any U.S. state to prescribe medication or non-complex health procedures for students. Bulletin 135, Health and Safety, is being amended to reflect that change. Act 745 updates several components of statute related to behavioral health services for students during school hours. This law and these updates are now in effect. Policy revisions to bring BESI policy into alignment with the revised statute and to provide for the dispute resolution process are scheduled for BESI consideration in August. Act 375 adds a training requirement for school nurses regarding caring for students with sickle cell disease. That information will be passed to schools when it is received by LDOE. Act 378 also requires local policy development and relates to the maintenance of a stock supply of certain life-saving medications in schools. Schools will need to identify relevant personnel that should receive related training. Act 657 makes similar provisions for early childhood centers. Act 331 provides clarity regarding the requirement to put the National Suicide Hotline number on student identification cards issued by schools. This number should include the digits 988. Act 324 requires school boards to adopt and implement programs to assist with the identification and support of students with behavioral or emotional challenges that may cause the student to be at risk for behavior issues. A consultation for possible referral to support services must occur after a second suspension in a school year. Several legislative acts related to immunizations or immunization status. Act 460 prohibits discrimination in schools based on vaccination status. This includes participation, seating arrangements, and surveying students regarding vaccination status. Act 674 prohibits requiring a COVID-19 vaccine as a condition of initial or continuing enrollment in a public or non-public school. Act 675 requires that any communication issued to students about immunization requirements also include information about the option for exemption from those requirements. Policy related to this legislation was approved by the board at their March meeting and is now in effect. The legislature also passed several measures directly related to school choice. Act 1 creates the LA Gator Scholarship Program to provide educational scholarship accounts for participating students. BESI will consider policy to provide for the implementation of this program at its August meeting, and more information for families and schools will be released in the coming weeks and months. Act 364 provides for direct Type 2 proposals for charter schools with corporate partners. Act 334 makes a number of updates to charter law, updating language in a number of places and defining operational autonomy in a number of areas as specified in the Act. Act 172 makes a number of updates related to charter terms and renewal criteria. Local authorizers should review policy, and LDOE will publish additional guidance for local authorizers even as we update the BESI processes for charter authorization and renewal. Act 659 amends the charter population threshold for economically disadvantaged students and students with disabilities from 85% to 70% and allows schools to be considered as meeting the requirement if the aggregate student enrollment data for all charters within system boundaries meet the requirement. Policy development in response to this act is happening in two parts, with the first part recommended for BESI consideration in August and the second part scheduled for October. Act 615 requires that students participating in home study programs be allowed to participate in, try out for, or apply for extracurricular activities or interscholastic athletics at the public school in the same manner, time, and place as the students who attend the public school. A number of acts were also passed that relate to school administration. Act 193 requires that within the performance evaluation, that is a provision of superintendent contracts, 15% must be based on evidence of growth in student achievement by the end of third grade in literacy and 15% in math, as determined by the state board. The policy proposal recommended for BESI consideration in August addresses this portion of the evaluation. Act 368 allows the state superintendent to assign a chief operating officer to city, parish, or local school systems that fail to meet the MFP instructional expenditure requirement for 2 consecutive years. This COO would support the development of recommendations for a plan to bring the district into compliance with the requirement. Act 641 requires a report from each school to its school board, a report from each school board to the LDOE, and a report from LDOE to certain legislative committees regarding DEI programming within schools. A report template is currently in development and will soon be released for use. Act 394 facilitates hiring retired teachers into critical shortage areas, and Act 594 supports retired bus drivers returning to part-time or full-time service. Act 780 prohibits taping a student's mouth or restricting the airway. Act 680 relates to the names and pronouns by which a student may be called at school. The act requires adoption of a local policy to implement the provisions as outlined in statute. It also establishes a number of requirements related to what can be asked of and required of students and employees regarding names and pronouns. Act 681 prohibits the discussion of certain topics with students outside of the adopted state content standards or the locally adopted approved curricula. Act 91 results in some changes to the course choice program, and BESI policy is being developed for consideration in October. A few notable shifts will include changes to who must approve a student's enrollment in a course and school-level responsibilities, including advising and provision of information. That concludes this presentation. Thank you for joining us today.